At my daughter's crowded dinner party, I walked into the house I had built with my own hands 30 years ago and found my son-in-law's father sitting at the head of my table in my chair. I quietly asked my daughter why no one had told me about the party. She barely looked at me. "I didn't invite you, Dad. My father-in-law is already here." I said nothing. I stood frozen for a second, turned toward the front door, and walked out. But what I did next made my daughter turn pale. "Thank you for being here. It truly means everything." Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country? I want to know. You are part of this community now. This is Dad Family Revenge, and this story was made for you. Note: certain details have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to actual people or places is coincidental. The message, however, is one worth carrying. I smelled the food before I even opened the front door. Green chili, roasted garlic, something sweet in the oven. My stomach turned. Not from hunger. From what those smells meant. Someone had been cooking in my kitchen for hours and nobody had called to tell me. I counted 22 cars parked along Marengo Avenue when I pulled up. 2 of them were blocking my own driveway. I sat behind the wheel for a moment, engine idling, looking at the light pouring out from every window of the house I built with my own 2 hands 30 years ago. Then I cut the engine and went inside. The noise hit me first. Laughter, the clink of glasses, a country song turned low on the speaker system Derek had installed in the living room without asking. The living room was packed. People I had never seen in my life were standing in groups, plates and hand drinks raised, talking over each other, the way people do when they feel completely at home. Richard Lawson was sitting at the head of my table. He was wearing a dark blazer, his silver hair combed back, one hand wrapped around a glass of red wine. He looked like a man presiding over something that belonged to him. He was sitting in my chair, the one I had built from a single plank of white oak I had hauled out of a yard in Burbank, the one where I had sat every morning with Margaret for 24 years. He looked up when I walked in, registered my face, and looked back down at his plate without a word. Helen spotted me from across the room. She was standing near the fireplace I had laid brick by brick the winter after Emily was born, the one Margaret used to press her cold hands against every November. Helen reached down, lifted a serving tray piled with food, and held it out toward me. "Walter, be a dear and bring this to the kitchen, would you?" she said. She was already turning back to the woman beside her before she finished the sentence. My chest tightened so hard I felt it in my back teeth. I looked for Emily. She was standing near the hallway, a glass of white wine in her hand, laughing at something a woman in a red dress had just said. She looked relaxed. She looked like someone who belonged exactly where she was. When she caught my eye, the laugh faded a little, but she did not move toward me. I walked to her. "Why didn't anyone tell me we were having people over tonight?" I kept my voice low. I kept it even. 30 years of construction work teaches you how to stay calm. When something is going wrong, you do not panic on a job site, you assess. Emily took a small breath. She glanced once toward Richard at the head of the table, then back at me. Her face was not guilty. It was not embarrassed. It was composed the way a person looks when they have already made a decision and no longer feel the need to defend it. "I didn't invite you, Dad," she said. "My father-in-law is already here." The words landed like a dropped beam. Around us, the conversation continued. Someone laughed too loudly near the window. A fork scraped against a plate. But the 2 people closest to Emily, a man in a polo shirt and a woman with short gray hair, had heard her. The man looked down at his shoes. The woman pressed her lips together and found something very interesting to study on the far wall. I stood there holding nothing in the middle of a party in my own home and understood with complete clarity that I was not a guest who had arrived late. I had never been on the list. I looked across the room at Richard Lawson, still sitting in my chair, still holding his wine, still not looking at me. I held my gaze on him for 3 full seconds, long enough for him to feel it even if he pretended not to. Long enough for a few of the people near the table to notice and go quiet. Then I set Helen's serving tray down on the nearest surface, turned around, and walked out the front door. Not because I had nothing to say, because I had finally figured out what I was going to do. Frank's truck was pulling up to the curb as I reached the bottom of the porch steps. He had swung by to drop off a toolbox I had left in his cab that morning. He took one look at my face and did not bother with a greeting. "What happened?" he said. I looked back at the house. Light in every window. 22 cars on my street. Music playing in my living room. "They're having a family dinner in my house," I said. "I'm not family." Frank was quiet for a moment. He set the toolbox down on the hood of his truck, crossed his arms, and looked at me the way he had been looking at me for 30 years straight, on no softening around the edges. "Then tomorrow," he said, "you need to decide who this house belongs to." I did not sleep that night. The basement ceiling was low, 6 feet 2 inches of clearance. I had measured it myself when I poured the foundation. I knew every crack in that concrete, every water stain along the south wall, every place where the old pipe fitting knocked when the heat kicked on. I had built this space to store lumber and tools, and the kind of things a man accumulates over 30 years of working with his hands. I had not built it to sleep in. The fold-out cot Frank had helped me drag down 3 months ago sat against the far wall underneath the single window that looked out at ground level onto the side yard. Through that window, I could see the bottoms of shoes walking past whenever someone stepped outside for air. At 11:30, I counted 4 pairs. At midnight, 2 more. The party upstairs did not wind down until well past 1 in the morning. I lay on that cot with my arms behind my head and listened to the whole thing. The music, the laughter, the sound of my kitchen being used by people who did not know which drawer held the good knives, or why the third burner on the left ran a little hot. I heard Richard's voice carrying over the rest, that broad, self-satisfied voice he used when he was performing for an audience. I heard Helen laugh at something, a high, sharp sound that bounced off the hardwood floors I had laid myself in the summer of 2001. I thought about how I had gotten here. It had started simply enough, the way these things always do. Emily had called on a Tuesday in June, her voice tight in the way it got when she needed something and was not sure how to ask. She and Derek were looking for a new place, she said. The market was brutal. Rents had gone through the roof. Would it be all right if they stayed with me for a little while, just until they found something? I had not said yes outright, but I had not said no either. I had said something like, "We can figure it out," which is the kind of thing a father says when he does not want to disappoint his daughter, and Emily had taken it as a yes. 2 days later, she arrived with Derek and 4 suitcases. 6 weeks after that, she called me into the living room and told me her in-laws needed somewhere to stay while their house in Arcadia was being renovated. Just a few weeks, she said. Richard and Helen were getting older. It would mean so much to Derek. I had stood in my own kitchen doorway, coffee going cold in my hand, and done what I always did. I said we could figure it out. What I had not figured out was that figuring it out meant I would be the one moving. First to the small bedroom off the hallway, then to the pull-out couch in the study when Derek decided he needed a home office, and finally down here to a basement that smelled like sawdust and old motor oil, sleeping on a cot I had bought at an army surplus store in Monrovia in 1998. Every step had come with a reasonable explanation. Every explanation had sounded almost sensible in the moment. And every time I had accepted one, the next one came faster and asked for more. The last shoe dropped from upstairs sometime around 1:15. After that, the house went quiet. I closed my eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, I kept hearing Frank's voice low and direct on the front porch the way it had been. Tomorrow, you need to decide who this house belongs to. By 7 in the morning, I had given up on sleep entirely and was sitting at the small workbench in the corner with a cup of coffee I had made on the single-burner hot plate I kept down there, the one Margaret used to tease me about when I worked late. She used to say I could survive anything as long as I had a hot plate and a bag of dark roast. She had not been wrong. Frank knocked at the back door at 8 sharp. He was not alone. Susan Parker came in behind him, carrying a white pastry box, the kind from the Portuguese bakery on Colorado Boulevard that Margaret had loved. Susan had lived across the street for 22 years. She and Margaret used to drink coffee on one porch or the other every Saturday morning from April through October, and she still brought those pastries to my door on significant occasions, the way other people brought flowers. I poured her a cup without being asked. She set the box on my kitchen table and looked around the room the way she always did when she first walked in. A slow, quiet inventory, the kind of look that missed very little. Then she turned toward the living room and walked in without a word. I followed her. She stopped in front of the fireplace. The mantel had been cleared. Every photograph of Margaret, the one from our first Christmas in this house, the one from Emily's college graduation, the small framed portrait I had taken myself on a Sunday afternoon in Descanso Gardens the year before she got sick, every single one was gone. In their place sat a row of framed photographs I did not recognize. Richard and Helen at some resort, Derek and Emily at a winery, a group shot of people I had never met laughing on a boat somewhere warm. Susan's jaw tightened. Her hand came up and gripped the edge of the mantel, her knuckles going white against the wood. "Walter," she said, and her voice had something in it I had not heard from her before. Not sympathy, not sorrow. Something harder than either of those. "Where are Margaret's pictures?" I opened my mouth to answer. Helen appeared in the doorway behind us, still in her silk robe, a cup of tea in her hand, completely unbothered. "Oh, I moved them," she said pleasantly. "We needed a little more life in here. You understand, Walter? You can't keep a house frozen in the past forever." Susan turned around slowly. She looked at Helen for a long moment, the pastry box still in one hand, and when she spoke, her voice was perfectly level. "I remember the day Walter built that fireplace," she said. "It was February. He worked outside in the cold for 11 days straight. Margaret brought him lunch every afternoon and sat on an overturned bucket to keep him company." She paused. "You didn't even know this house existed." The temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. Helen's pleasant expression did not exactly fall, but it shifted the way a mask shifts when the person wearing it realizes it is no longer doing its job. She set her tea down on the side table, turned without another word, and walked back down the hallway. The bedroom door clicked shut behind her. Susan looked at me. Her eyes were dry, but there was a grief in them that I recognized because I had been carrying the same thing for months without knowing what to call it. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. "Long enough," I said. Susan set the pastry box down on the coffee table and sat on the edge of the couch, the new couch, the one Derek had bought, without asking, the one that had replaced the worn blue sofa Margaret and I had picked out together at a furniture store in Pasadena the year we moved in. Susan did not comment on the couch. She just looked at me and waited. So I told her. I told her about the curtains first. Margaret had sewn them herself, cream cotton with a narrow blue stripe. Nothing fancy, but she had spent 3 weekends getting the hems exactly right. Emily had taken them down 4 days after moving in and replaced them with gray linen panels she ordered online. When I asked about it, She said the old ones were dated. I let it go. Then came the chair. Margaret's reading chair, the small wingback she had reupholstered herself in a dark green fabric she found at a remnant shop on Foothill Boulevard. Derek had moved it to the garage without mentioning it to me. When I found it pushed against the wall behind the lawnmower, he told me it didn't go with the new look they were going for. I let that go too. Then Richard and Helen arrived, and the pace of things changed. Susan's expression did not shift while I talked, but her hands did. She had been holding her coffee cup loosely in her lap. By the time I finished, both hands were wrapped around it tight, like she needed something solid to hold on to. "I know," she said quietly. I looked at her. "I've been watching from across the street." Her voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it, the kind that comes from keeping something in for too long. "I didn't say anything because I thought maybe you'd agreed to it. I thought maybe I was misreading what I saw." She pressed her lips together. "I wasn't misreading it." "What did you see?" Frank asked. He was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching her. "Shirley, Derek, and Emily," Susan said. "Moving things out of this house. Not once. Regularly. Over several weeks. Boxes, bags, pieces of furniture. Always when Walter wasn't home." She looked at me directly. "That rocking chair from the back porch. The brass lamp from the upstairs hallway. A box of tools from the garage. That last one landed differently than the rest." "Which tools?" I said. Susan set her cup down. "The ones in the red metal case. The ones Margaret gave you." I was out the back door before she finished the sentence. The garage was dim and cool, smelling of motor oil and dry concrete. I went straight to the shelving unit along the south wall where I had kept Margaret's gift for 26 years, a full set of woodworking tools she had saved up for over 8 months and presented to me on my 34th birthday, each one wrapped individually in brown paper. Chisels, gouges, a marking gauge, 2 hand planes. She had watched me unwrap every single one with her arms crossed and a look on her face, like she had just pulled off something she was very proud of. The red metal case was gone. In its place sat 3 plastic storage bins stacked to the ceiling, packed with Derek's cycling gear foam rollers and a set of resistance bands still in the packaging. Frank appeared beside me. He pulled one of the bins aside and crouched down. Behind it, shoved against the baseboard, was the red case. Scratched, dusty, turned on its side like something that had been moved in a hurry and forgotten about. I crouched down and opened it. Everything was still inside. The chisels, the marking gauge, both hand planes. Every tool Margaret had wrapped in brown paper on a morning I still remembered clearly. My throat tightened in a way I had not expected. I picked up the smallest chisel, the one I had used more than any other, the one that still had a small chip on the handle from a job I did the winter after she died. I turned it over in my hands. "Walter," Frank said. I stood up. "They're not going to stop," I said. "Not unless I make them." Frank nodded once. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. But I had not always known what I knew standing in that garage. There was a time not long ago, but long enough to embarrass me now, when I genuinely believed that if I was patient, if I kept the peace, things would eventually correct themselves. Families work things out. That is what I had told myself through October and into November, through every small thing that disappeared, and every new thing that appeared in its place, without anyone asking me. The workshop was where it started to unravel. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, about 5 months before the night of the party. I had come in from the backyard to find Derek standing in the doorway of my workshop, with his arms crossed, and an expression on his face like a man appraising a property he was thinking of buying. "You know," he said, If you knocked this down, you could put in a real patio back here. Stone pavers, built-in grill, the whole setup. Richard knows a contractor who does good work. I set down the handplane I was carrying. I'm not knocking it down. Derek shrugged the way he did when he thought he was being patient with someone who was not quite keeping up. It's just an old shed, Walter. It's a permitted structure, I said. I pulled the building permit myself in 1994. It's on the property record. Before Derek could answer, Richard appeared at the back gate. He had let himself in through the side yard, without knocking, the way he had started doing sometime in September, as though the concept of asking permission was a custom that applied to other people. He looked at the workshop, looked at the chalk marks Derek had made along the base of the exterior wall. I had not noticed those until that moment, and nodded slowly. Good bones on the lot, Richard said. Shame to waste it on a tool shed. I looked at the chalk marks, 4 of them evenly spaced, like someone had already measured out where the demolition would begin. Nobody is touching this workshop, I said. I looked at Richard when I said it, not Derek. Not the structure, not what's inside it. This is not a discussion. Richard met my eyes for a moment. Then he smiled, not a warm smile, the kind that does not reach anything above the cheekbones, and said, "We'll see about that, Walter." They went inside. I stood in the yard and looked at those chalk marks for a long time. Margaret used to bring 2 cups of coffee out here on Saturday mornings and sit in the small wooden chair by the window while I worked. She never tried to help. She knew better than to hand a man the wrong tool, but she liked to watch. She said there was something satisfying about seeing a person do the thing they were made to do. I had never taken that chair out of the workshop. It was still there against the wall underneath the pegboard where the hand tools hung. I went inside and started making dinner. An hour later, Derek's friend Marcus Webb showed up. I had met him once before at a barbecue. Derek had hosted a loud, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s who sold commercial real estate and talked about it constantly. He and Derek went into the living room, and I stayed in the kitchen working on the chicken. I was not trying to listen. The kitchen and the living room shared a half wall, and Marcus Webb had a voice that carried. "I'm just saying, man, $340,000 doesn't disappear quietly," Marcus said. "The Riverside deal went sideways, and now you've got the note coming due in, 8 months? Derek said something I could not make out. "I hear you," Marcus said. "But your dad already said no, so what's the play? You need to think about what assets are actually available to you." I kept my eyes on the pan. I turned the chicken. I reached over and adjusted the flame on the 3rd burner, the one that ran hot, the one I had known about for 15 years. $340,000. A note coming due in 8 months. Richard had already said no. I put those 3 facts together in my head, the way I used to put together load-bearing calculations on a job site, carefully, without rushing, making sure each piece sat level before I moved to the next one. By the time the chicken was done, I had a structure. That night, I went out to the workshop after everyone had gone to bed. I sat in Margaret's chair. The chalk marks on the exterior wall were invisible in the dark, but I knew exactly where they were. I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I walked outside and photographed each chalk mark, 4 images, date-stamped location services on. Then I went back inside and sat down again. The note was coming due in 8 months. Richard had said no. And I was sitting in a house that, according to the Pasadena County Assessor's Office, was worth somewhere north of $1.2 million. I began to understand what I was dealing with. The barbecue was Richard's idea, which meant it was Richard's production. He announced it on a Wednesday evening in November, standing in the middle of my kitchen, like a man addressing a staff meeting. He wanted to host his business associates, 12, maybe 15 people, he said, though. I would later count 23. He wanted it Saturday. He wanted brisket pulled pork, the full setup. He looked at me when he said it the way people look at a catering manager. "I'll need you up early to get the grill going," he said. "And we'll want the back patio cleared out by 10. I was up at 6:30. I moved the patio furniture, spread the charcoal, set up the folding tables along the fence line. I worked for 3 hours in the November morning cold, my breath coming out in small clouds over the Weber grill Margaret and I had bought at a Home Depot on Rosemead Boulevard the summer Emily turned 12. By the time the first cars arrived at noon, everything was ready. Derek met me at the back door as I was coming in to wash my hands. "Hey," he said, lowering his voice like he was doing me a favor. "Richard's crowd is mostly business. Finance guys, couple of developers. It might be better if you kind of hung back today. Let us do the hosting." I looked at him. "It's just a vibe thing," he said. "You know how it is." I dried my hands on the dish towel and went back outside. I stood near the far end of the yard by the lemon tree Margaret had planted the year we moved in, and watched 23 people I had never met eat food I had spent the morning preparing in a yard I had landscaped myself over the course of 15 years. Richard held court near the grill. He had a pair of long-handled tongs that I had never seen before. He must have bought them specifically for the occasion, and he worked the grill with the confidence of a man who grilled regularly, which I happened to know he did not. He told a story that made everyone within 10 feet laugh. He refilled glasses, he shook hands. He called my backyard our place twice that I heard. Marcus Webb was there standing with a group near the pergola I had built in 2008. He caught my eye once, gave me a brief nod, and looked away. He knew exactly who I was. A man I did not recognize, heavy-set good suit, the kind of sunglasses that cost more than my first truck, turned from the group and looked up at the back of the house. "Nice place," he said to no one in particular. "Who built it?" Derek was standing 3 feet from me. Emily was standing 2 feet from Derek. I drew breath to answer. "My dad did part of it," Emily said. The heavy-set man nodded, already losing interest, and turned back to his group. I looked at my daughter. She was reaching for a glass of wine from the table, her attention already elsewhere, completely unaware of what she had just done. Or completely aware, which was worse. 30 years. The foundation, the framing, the electrical rough-in, the drywall, the finish work, every cabinet in that kitchen, the fireplace, the hardwood floors, the pergola that man in the good suit was standing under. I had built all of it. Margaret had painted the shutters and planted the garden and chosen every light fixture, and together we had made something out of a bare lot on a street where nobody knew our names yet. Part of it. I put my glass down on the table and went inside. I washed the dishes that had already accumulated in the sink. I wrapped the leftover food. I wiped down the counters. When the last car left at 4:30, I cleaned the grill, folded the tables, and stacked the chairs in the garage. Nobody offered to help. Nobody noticed I was doing it. At 6 o'clock, I drove to Frank's house on Pasadena Drive. He answered the door in his work clothes, a cup of coffee in his hand, and took one look at my face. "Come in," he said. I sat at his kitchen table and told him everything. Not just the barbecue, everything. October, the chalk marks Marcus Webb, and the $340,000, the note coming due. Frank listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about him. He did not offer opinions until he had the full picture. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he got up, went to the small corkboard above his phone and unpinned a business card. He set it on the table in front of me. Laura Mitchell, attorney at law, real property and estate transactions. A Pasadena address on Union Street. She handled my dad's estate, Frank said. Sharp, doesn't waste time. He tapped the card once with one finger. "I'm not telling you to sue anyone, Walter. I'm telling you to know exactly where you stand before they push you out of it." I picked up the card. I had kept the business card in my shirt pocket for 3 weeks before I did anything with it. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment. The truth was, I did not know how to make the call without admitting to myself that things had gone far enough to require a lawyer. There is a version of a man who calls an attorney about his own daughter, and I had spent 60 years not being that man. Then came Christmas. Emily had decorated the living room the week before. A tall, artificial tree in the corner, LED lights along the mantel, a wreath on the front door that Helen had picked out. It looked like a showroom. It looked like a house where no one had ever actually lived. Margaret used to put up a real tree every year, a Douglas fir from the lot on Lake Avenue, and the whole house smelled like pine needles from the 20th of December until well into January. This tree smelled like nothing. I had bought gifts for all 4 of them. I wrapped them myself the way Margaret had taught me, tight corners, no gaps at the seams, and placed them under the tree 3 days before Christmas. On Christmas morning, the 4 of them gathered in the living room while I sat in the armchair near the window. They opened every package under the tree. When it was done, the floor was covered in wrapping paper and ribbon, and there was not a single thing left with my name on it. Emily looked up from a cashmere sweater Derek had given her and caught my expression. For a half second, something moved across her face. Not guilt, exactly, more like a person calculating whether a thing needs to be addressed. She decided it did not. "Dad, you're 60, she said, her voice bright and easy. "What do you even need?" I stood up and said I was going to get my jacket. My room, the small one at the end of the hall. The one I had moved into after giving up the master, had a narrow closet and a 3-drawer dresser that had been in the house since before Emily was born. The top drawer was where I kept the things I did not use often but needed to be able to find. My passport, the deed to the house, a folded photograph of Margaret and me at Yosemite in 1991, and in the back left corner, sitting on a square of folded flannel, the small wooden box. Margaret had given it to me on our last anniversary before she got sick. Inside was a watch, not expensive, not a brand anyone would recognize, just a clean-faced Bulova with a brown leather strap that she had found at an estate sale in San Marino and had serviced and polished before she wrapped it. She had written on the inside of the box lid in her handwriting, "For the man who built something worth keeping." The wooden box was not in the back left corner of the drawer. I pulled the drawer all the way out. I checked behind the dresser, thinking it might have been knocked back. I opened the other 2 drawers. I got down on one knee and looked under the bed. The box was gone. I found it 20 minutes later on the floor of the closet in the master bedroom, behind a pair of Helen's shoes. The flannel it had been sitting on was still inside. The watch was still inside. But it had been moved without anyone telling me to make room. I could see this clearly when I looked at the dresser for a jewelry organizer Helen had brought with her from Arcadia. I carried the box downstairs. I put on my coat and my boots. I told Emily I was going for a walk, which was not entirely untrue. Susan's porch light was on. She answered the door in her housecoat, one look at my face, and stepped back without a word to let me in. "I need you to keep something for me," I said. I held out the box. She took it in both hands. She did not open it. She did not ask what was inside. She just looked at me with those careful eyes that had known Margaret for 20 years and said, "I'll put it somewhere safe tonight." "Thank you," I said. I walked home through the cold. The Christmas lights on the neighboring houses reflected off the wet pavement in long colored streaks. My own house glowed at the end of the block, warm and bright and full of people. I stood on the front porch for a moment before going in. Then I went upstairs, sat on the edge of my narrow bed, and took Frank's business card out of my shirt pocket. I had moved it from jacket to jacket for 3 weeks without making the call. I set the card on the dresser where the wooden box used to be. In the morning, I would dial the number. Laura Mitchell's office was on Union Street, 4 blocks from the courthouse, on the second floor of a building that had been a bank in a previous life. The waiting area had the particular stillness of a place where people came to deal with things they had been putting off. A woman in her 50s sat across from me with a folder on her lap, her jaw set in the way of someone who had made a decision and was not going back on it. I recognized that expression. I had been wearing it for the past 12 hours. Laura came out to get me herself. She was 57, compact, with short gray hair and reading glasses pushed up on her head. She shook my hand the way contractors shake hands, firm, brief, no performance in it, and led me back to her office. "Frank Miller speaks highly of you," she said, settling into her chair. "He also told me not to waste your time with small talk, so I won't." I put the folder I had brought on her desk. 30 years of documents. The original purchase agreement for the lot, the construction permits, pulled in phases as I built the house, the deed, the property tax records, the homeowner's insurance policy. Every piece of paper that proved what the house was and who it belonged to. Laura went through the folder the way a good inspector goes through a structure methodically, without rushing, pausing at certain points to read more carefully. She did not speak for several minutes. Finally, she looked up. "The deed is in your name only," she said. "No co-signers, no joint tenancy, no recorded liens. This property belongs to you completely and exclusively under California law." She set the deed on the desk between us. "Your daughter has no legal claim to this property while you are living. Her husband has no claim. His parents have no claim. No one staying in this house, regardless of how long they have been there or what they have contributed to household expenses, has acquired any ownership interest in your property. I had known this in the way you know something you have not let yourself examine directly. Hearing it stated plainly by someone whose job was to know felt different than knowing it privately." "What about the utilities?" I asked. "Derek pays the electricity, the gas, the internet. Does that give him any rights?" Laura shook her head. "Paying utilities in someone else's home does not create a property interest. It does not create tenancy. It does not create any legal claim whatsoever." She folded her hands on the desk. "What you have here, Walter, is a license arrangement. You gave your daughter and her family permission to occupy your home. That permission can be revoked." "How?" "California Civil Code, Section 1946, she said. "You serve what's called a notice to quit. Because your family members are licensees, meaning they occupy the property with your permission, but without a written lease and without paying rent, you are entitled to terminate that arrangement with 30 days written notice. They have 30 days to vacate. If they do not leave voluntarily, you file an unlawful detainer action in Superior Court, and a judge orders them out." She paused. "But in my experience, when people understand the notice is legally valid and enforceable, they leave." I looked at the deed on her desk. My name printed clearly in the county recorder's font, just as it had been for 30 years. "What do I do in the meantime?" I asked. "Document everything," Laura said. She leaned forward slightly. "Every item removed from the property without your consent. Every structural change made without your approval. Dates, photographs, descriptions. If anyone attempts to represent themselves as an owner or co-owner of this property to a third party, I need to know about it immediately." She handed me a legal pad and a pen. "Start now, if you like. Tell me what has already happened." I spent the next 40 minutes telling her. She wrote steadily and did not interrupt. When I finished, she reviewed her notes, added 2 items she had pulled from what I had said, and set the pad aside. "You have more documentation than you think," she said. and more options than they believe you have. She stood and extended her hand. I'll draw up the notice when you're ready. You tell me when. I drove home on the 210, the late morning sun, flat and white over the San Gabriel Mountains. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had decided that Laura was right about the documentation. I went through every room with my phone before anyone else was awake the next morning. The living room, the kitchen, both bathrooms, the master bedroom where Richard and Helen slept in my bed. I photographed the mantel without Margaret's pictures. I photographed the dresser in my old room where Helen's jewelry organizer now sat. I photographed the garage where my tools had been displaced. 41 photographs time-stamped, stored in a folder I labeled with that day's date. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my coffee when my phone rang. Frank. "Walter," he said. "There's a woman standing on the sidewalk in front of your house taking pictures with a professional camera." I set my coffee down and went to the front window. She was standing on the public sidewalk just past my property line, which told me she knew exactly what she was doing. Early 40s professional camera with a wide-angle lens, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. She was photographing the front elevation, the roofline, the porch columns, the garage with the focused, unhurried efficiency of someone being paid by the hour. When she heard the front door open, she lowered the camera and gave me a polite, slightly cautious smile. "Good morning," she said. "Are you Walter Bennett?" "I am." She extended her hand. "Carol Morgan. I'm a licensed real estate agent with Pacific Rim Properties in Arcadia. I was contacted about doing a preliminary market assessment on this property." She gestured toward the house with her portfolio. "Whoever ends up listing it will want current exterior photos in the file before the interior walkthrough." I kept my hands in my jacket pockets. "Who contacted you?" A small hesitation. "Derek Lawson?" He indicated he was part of the ownership group. The cold morning air moved through the pepper tree at the edge of the driveway. I could hear the faint sound of a lawnmower 2 streets over. I took a breath and let it out slowly. "Ms. Morgan," I said, "Derek Lawson does not own any part of this property. His name does not appear on the deed. He has no legal authority to authorize an assessment, a listing, or any other transaction involving this house." Carol Morgan's expression shifted, not dramatically, but in the careful way of a professional who has just realized she has been given inaccurate information by a client. Her hand tightened slightly on the portfolio. "I see," she said. "I apologize for the confusion, Mr. Bennett. I was not aware of the full ownership situation." She capped her lens. "I obviously can't proceed without the verified owner's consent. I'll need to speak with Mr. Lawson about the discrepancy." "You don't need to do anything on my account," I said. "I just wanted you to have accurate information." She nodded, tucked the camera under her arm, and walked back to her car, a gray Camry parked 2 houses down. I watched her go, then went inside. Emily was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee, scrolling through her phone. She was still in her pajamas, her hair pulled back, looking like someone who had slept well and had no particular plans for the morning. I sat down at the table across from her. "There was a real estate agent outside," I said, "taking pictures of the house. She said Derek called her about a market assessment." Emily's thumb stopped moving on her phone screen. "She told me he represented himself as part of the ownership group," I said. I corrected her. Emily set the phone face down on the counter. She picked up her mug with both hands and looked into it the way people look at things when they are deciding how much of the truth to offer. "We've been talking about it," she said finally. "The house. Selling it." She did not look up. "It's a lot of space for one person, Dad. The market is strong right now, and if you sold, you'd have enough to buy something smaller. Something that doesn't need as much upkeep. Something easier." She paused. "And we could use the difference to get stable." I looked at my daughter across my kitchen table in the house I had built before she was old enough to walk. Stable, I said, or debt-free. Emily's head came up. The color left her face in a single visible wave, starting at her jaw and moving upward. Her fingers tightened around the mug until her knuckles pressed white against the ceramic. She knew I knew about the $340,000. She knew I knew about the note. She set the mug down carefully, like she was afraid of breaking something, and did not say another word. Derek appeared in the doorway a moment later, still in his clothes, from the night before, reading whatever had just happened in Emily's face. He looked at me. I looked back at him. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said. I refilled my coffee and went out to the workshop. That night, I lay on my cot in the basement with the lights off, listening to the house settle around me. Upstairs, through the floor, I could hear Derek and Emily talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the basement carried sound in certain ways I had learned over 30 years. Derek's voice flat and certain. "He's going to come around. He always does." A pause. Then Emily quieter. "I don't know." "He always does," Derek said again. I put my arm over my eyes and stared at the dark behind them. Somewhere in my chest, something that had been knotted for months began very slowly to loosen. Not because things were better, because I had stopped pretending they were going to fix themselves. And for the first time since any of this had started, I smiled. Before I reveal what Frank found, the one piece of evidence that changed everything and broke my heart in a way I was not prepared for, drop a 9 in the comments right now, so I know you are still with me. I read every single one, and tonight I need to know you are here. And a note before we continue: some details in this story have been shaped for clarity and reflection. What follows may not reflect every real circumstance. If that is not the kind of story you are here for, this is a good moment to step away. But if you are staying, what Frank showed me next will explain everything. Frank called on a Thursday afternoon and asked me to come over. He did not say why. Frank never explained himself on the phone. He was from a generation that considered telephone conversations a way to establish logistics, not conduct them. But there was something in the flatness of his voice that made me put on my jacket without finishing my coffee. His house on Pasadena Drive was the same one he had lived in for 31 years, a craftsman bungalow with a detached garage he had converted into a proper woodshop sometime in the 90s. I had helped him run the electrical for it. He met me at the door and led me straight to the kitchen without the usual offer of coffee, which told me something. His laptop was open on the table. "Sit down," he said. I sat. 3 weeks ago, I got an email I wasn't supposed to get." He turned the laptop toward me. "Emily sent it to the wrong address. My email and Derek's are one letter apart. We worked the same Henderson project in 2019, used the same company domain for 6 months. She must have been on her tablet typing fast, didn't check before she hit send." I looked at the screen. It was a forwarded listing from a property management company in Glendale. A one-bedroom apartment on Kenneth Road, 640 square feet, second floor, one assigned parking space. The monthly rent was listed at $2,100. Below the listing and the body of Emily's message to Derek, 4 words in plain text for Dad. Temporary. The timestamp at the top of the email read July 14th. I sat with that for a moment. July 14th. I counted backward. Richard and Helen had moved in during the second week of August. I had been pushed to the pull-out couch in the study by the end of that same month. I had been in the basement by mid-September. Emily had found him an apartment before any of that happened, before Richard and Helen arrived, before the study, before the basement, before every explanation that had been offered to me, as though it arose naturally from circumstances, as though each new arrangement had been a reasonable response to a situation nobody had planned. She had planned it. "Walter." Frank's voice was careful. I realized I had been staring at the screen without moving for longer than I thought. I reached out and scrolled up, looking for anything else in the thread. There was nothing. Just the listing and those 4 words. For Dad. Temporary. I closed the laptop gently. I did not slam it. I set my hands flat on the table and looked at the grain of the wood oak. I noticed the same species as my dining table, the one Richard had been sitting at the head of for months. "How long have you had this?" I asked. 3 weeks, Frank said. I didn't know what to do with it. I kept thinking I was misreading it, that there was some other explanation. He paused. "There isn't another explanation, is there?" It was not a question. "No," I said. "There isn't." Frank sat down across from me. He did not offer a solution. He did not tell me what I should feel or what I should do next. He just sat there, which was the right thing to do, and waited. I thought about the Tuesday in June when Emily had called, asking if she and Derek could stay for a while. I had heard the tightness in her voice and told myself it was financial stress. Young people had it hard. The housing market was brutal. I had not once considered that the tightness might be something else, the particular strain of a person executing a plan they were not entirely comfortable with. For Dad. Temporary. She had looked at an apartment for me before she asked to move into my house. She had already decided where I was going before she asked me where she could stay. I stood up from the table. I went to the kitchen window and looked out at Frank's backyard. The raised vegetable beds he maintained with the same precision he had always brought to construction work, the old fig tree in the corner, or the tool shed with the red door. Everything in its right place. Everything belonging to the person who had built it. My chest did not tighten. My hands did not shake. Something that might have been grief moved through me and kept moving the way a wave passes through a structure that was built to take it. "Frank," I said without turning from the window, "what does California law say about how long someone has to vacate a property after the owner asks them to leave?" I heard him exhale behind me. Not with surprise. With something more like relief, the way a man exhales when the person next to him finally says out loud the thing they have both been thinking. 30 days, he said. If there's no lease. I turned around. Then I need to talk to Laura again, I said. Laura had a cancellation on a Friday morning, which is how I ended up sitting across from her again less than a week after Frank's kitchen table. I told her about the email. She listened without expression, made a note, and set her pen down. "That establishes premeditation," she said. "It won't change your legal position, you don't need it to. But if this ever goes to an unlawful detainer, hearing a judge will find it relevant that the plan to displace you predated the occupation of the property." She folded her hands. "Are you ready to proceed with the notice?" I told her I was not ready yet. I told her I wanted to wait for the right moment. Laura looked at me the way people look at someone who has just said something she considers mildly irrational, but is too professional to argue with. "The notice is valid whenever you serve it," she said. 30 days runs from the date of service, not from any particular event. "I understand that," I said. "I want to choose the moment." She accepted this without further comment and spent the next 20 minutes walking me through the mechanics. A notice to quit, served on a licensee, meaning a person occupying property with the owner's permission, but without a written lease and without paying rent, required 30 days written notice under California Civil Code, Section 1946. The notice had to be delivered in person or posted on the front door with a copy mailed by certified mail. Once the 30 days elapsed, if the occupants had not vacated, I could file an unlawful detainer action, in Pasadena Superior Court. A hearing would be scheduled within 20 days. If the court found in my favor, a writ of possession would be issued, and a sheriff's deputy would oversee the removal. It rarely gets that far, Laura said. People who understand the notice is legally airtight tend to make their own arrangements. She prepared the documents that afternoon. I signed where she indicated and took a copy home in a manila envelope that I put in the bottom drawer of the workbench in my workshop, underneath a catalog from a tool supplier in Chatsworth. That same week, Richard announced the party. He did it at dinner on a Tuesday, the way he announced everything as a statement, rather than a proposal with the assumption of agreement built into the delivery. He and Helen were going to celebrate their 40th wedding anniversary. He wanted to do it properly. He had already spoken to a catering company and a rental outfit that handled tables and linens. He expected 40 guests, perhaps more. He wanted to use the house the last Saturday of the month. He did not ask me. He told me. I said that sounded fine. Frank, sitting across from me at breakfast 2 days later, looked up from his eggs when I told him. Something moved across his face, a quick, suppressed thing gone almost immediately. He went back to his eggs. "You're going to let them have their party," he said. "Yes," I said. Frank chewed, swallowed, drank his coffee. And then, I said, "I'm going to walk in." He set his cup down and looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he has understood something that does not require elaboration. 4 days before the party, Helen made her move on the photographs. I came downstairs on a Tuesday morning to find the mantel cleared again. Every photograph of Margaret, including the ones I had replaced after her first attempt, was gone. In their place, arranged with evident care, sat framed photographs of the Lawson family. Richard and Helen at their first anniversary. Derek and Emily at a vineyard in Napa. A group shot I did not recognize. On the kitchen counter sat a cardboard box with the flaps folded in. I opened it. Margaret looked up at me from inside her face, pressed against a photograph of Emily's college graduation, the frame slightly bent, where it had been pushed in too quickly. I took every photograph out of the box and carried them upstairs to my room. Emily found me there 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway and looked at the photographs lined up along the windowsill, and something in her face moved in a way I could not quite read. "Mom told her it was okay," she said, meaning Helen. Meaning she had given permission for someone to box up her own mother. I did not trust what would come out of my mouth if I opened it. I carried the photographs back downstairs and set them on the mantel, each one in its original position. Then I put on my jacket and went for a walk. The Church of the Good Shepherd on Cordova Street was lit from inside when I passed it. Pastor Whitfield was on the front steps working a key into the lock of the side door, his breath coming out in small clouds in the February night air. He was 65 tall, with the particular stillness of a man who had spent decades listening more than speaking. He had officiated at Margaret's funeral. He looked up when he heard my footsteps. "Hi, Walter Bennett," he said. Not a greeting exactly, more like a man confirming something he had expected. We stood on the steps for a few minutes. I did not tell him everything. I told him enough. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his keys over in his hand. Margaret used to say, "You were the most patient man she had ever known," he said. She did not always mean it as a compliment. He looked at me steadily. "Patience is a virtue, Walter. But there is a difference between patience and permission. One is a choice you make. The other is a choice you allow someone else to make for you." I walked home. The house was quiet when I came in. The mantel photographs were undisturbed. I went to the kitchen and called Laura. "I'm ready," I said, a pause on the line. Then, "Come in tomorrow morning. We'll make sure everything is airtight." Frank arrived at 7:15 with a legal pad and a tape measure. Susan came 5 minutes later with her own notebook. The small, spiral-bound kind she had been carrying in her coat pocket since October. The one with the blue cover and the dates written in her neat, compressed handwriting along the top of each page. She set it on my kitchen table without comment and went to stand by the front window looking out at the street the way she always did when she first arrived, taking inventory of what had changed since her last visit. I had coffee ready. Nobody touched it. We started in the living room. Frank moved through the space the way he moved through a job site, systematic, unhurried, noting what was present and what was absent. He photographed the mantel, the replaced curtains, the new furniture that had displaced my own. Susan wrote in her notebook while he worked, cross-referencing dates from memory with the entries she had already made. I stood in the doorway and watched them and understood, not for the first time, that I had better friends than I deserved. We worked through the kitchen, the hallway, the master bedroom. I knocked, and when no one answered, I went in and documented what Helen had done to the space. The dresser arrangement, the jewelry organizer, the closet reorganized around her, and Richard's my remaining clothes pushed to one end like an afterthought. Then we came to the small reading room off the back hallway. It was a room Margaret had claimed early in our marriage, 8 feet by 10, just large enough for a chair, a lamp, and the low walnut table she had found at an estate sale in Sierra Madre the year after we moved in. She had refinished it herself over 2 weekends, stripping and sanding and applying 3 coats of tung oil until the grain came up clean and dark. She read there every evening for 22 years. After she died, I left the room exactly as it was. The walnut table was gone. The chair was still there. The lamp was still there. The indentation in the carpet where the table had stood for more than 2 decades was still there. But the table itself was gone, and in its place sat 2 of Helen's suitcases, stacked and latched, taking up the corner as though the room had always been storage. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Frank looked at me from across the room. "When did that go?" he asked. "I don't know," I said. I stopped going in here. I went to the kitchen and called Helen's cell phone. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the mild impatience of someone interrupted during something more important. "The walnut table from the reading room, Sarko," I said. "Where is it?" A brief pause. "Oh, that." Her tone shifted into something approximating reasonableness. "I gave it to my sister. She needed a side table and it was just sitting there unused. I didn't think you'd mind." "Call her," I said. "Tell her I want it back." "Walter, it's just a—" "Call her today," I said. "I'll be in touch with my attorney about the return." I hung up and wrote the date and Helen's exact words in Frank's legal pad. California Civil Code Section 3336 covered the wrongful taking of personal property. Laura would know what to do with it. We finished the main house and went out to the workshop. Susan waited until Frank had moved to the far end of the room to examine the wall where Derek's chalk marks had been before I photographed them. Then she reached into her coat and set her notebook on the workbench in front of me. "I want you to have this," she said. "All of it. Everything I wrote down." I opened it to the first entry. October 3rd, 7:45 in the morning. Derek and Emily carrying boxes from the garage to a rental van. 4 boxes, medium-sized. Walter's truck not in the driveway. I turned pages. The entries were precise and consistent times, descriptions, weather conditions noted in parentheses, as though she understood they might matter someday. 14 weeks of observation recorded in the handwriting of a woman who had decided quietly and without announcement that someone needed to be paying attention. "Margaret asked me to," Susan said before I could speak. She was looking at the small wooden chair in the corner, The one Margaret used to sit in on Saturday mornings. Not specifically, but the last time I saw her, she told me you were the kind of man who built things for other people and forgot to keep anything for himself. She paused. She wasn't wrong. Something broke open in my chest, not painfully, but the way a window breaks open in a room that has been closed too long. I sat down on the workbench stool and pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes and stayed that way for a minute. Maybe two. Frank did not say anything. Susan did not say anything. They let it happen and waited. When I looked up, the workshop was the same as it had always been. My tools on the pegboard, the smell of sawdust and linseed oil, the chair where Margaret used to sit. My phone rang on the workbench beside me, an unfamiliar number with a Pasadena area code. Mr. Bennett. A man's voice, measured and official. This is Ray Dominguez. I'm a building inspector with the city of Pasadena. I need to speak with you about a permit application that was filed on your property. Ray Dominguez was exactly the kind of man I had worked alongside for 30 years. He showed up the next morning in a city vehicle, gray-templed, wearing a polo shirt with the Pasadena Building and Safety Division logo on the chest, and carrying a clipboard with the particular authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that mattered. He was 55, maybe 56, with the careful movements of a man who had learned that haste created problems you spent the rest of the week correcting. I met him at the front door, and we shook hands the way tradesmen shake hands. I remember when you pulled the permits on this place, he said, looking up at the roof line. 94, 95. You did the foundation work yourself. All of it, I said. Come around back. We walked through the side gate to the workshop. Ray examined the exterior walls, checked the permit placard I had kept in a sleeve inside the workshop door since the day the final inspection cleared, and made several notes on his clipboard without speaking. Then he turned and held out a document. It was a permit application, submitted 2 weeks prior to the City of Pasadena Building and Safety Division, requesting authorization to demolish an existing accessory structure at my address and replace it with a poured concrete patio and outdoor kitchen. The application listed the project owner as Derek Lawson. In the field marked ownership status, someone had typed the words, co-owner. I read it twice. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice even. He is not a co-owner, I said. His name does not appear on the deed. He has no ownership interest in this property of any kind. Ray nodded slowly, the nod of a man who had suspected as much before he drove over. That's consistent with what I found when I pulled the assessor's records this morning, he said. Property is in your name only. Has been since the original transfer. He took the application back and made a notation in the margin. Mr. Bennett filing a permit application and misrepresenting your ownership status to a city agency is a violation of California Penal Code Section 115. Knowingly filing a false instrument with a government office is a felony. The words sat in the air between us for a moment. The application has been denied, Ray continued. I'll be forwarding the file to the city attorney's office for review. That process runs on its own timeline. I can't tell you what they'll do with it, but it goes into the record. He looked at me steadily. Your workshop is a permitted structure with a valid certificate of occupancy. Nobody touches it without your written authorization. If anyone attempts to begin demolition work, you call this number. He handed me a card with a direct line. We respond to unpermitted demolition the same day. I walked Ray back to the front of the house. He paused at the gate, hand on the latch. I've known you a long time, Walter, he said. I'm glad you're still in this house. I watched his city vehicle pull away from the curb. Then I went inside and called Laura. She listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. I had learned that 3 seconds of quiet from Laura meant she was assembling something, not stalling. "The permit application is significant," she said. Derek represented himself as a co-owner of real property to a government agency. That's the kind of thing that tends to focus people's attention when it appears in a legal filing. A pause. "I'll add it to the file. Keep Ray's card and the copy of the application." I made copies of everything on the small printer I kept in the workshop and put the originals in the manila envelope with the notice to quit. The envelope was getting thick. I went back inside through the kitchen. Richard was in the living room, settled into the armchair near the window with the morning paper. His reading glasses low on his nose, his coffee on the side table. He looked like a man in his own home on a Saturday morning, completely at ease, completely certain of his place in the room. He looked up when I came in. For the previous 8 months, whenever our eyes met, I had been the one to look away first. A small thing. The kind of small thing that accumulates. This time I did not look away. I held his gaze across the living room for a long moment, long enough for him to register that something had changed, long enough for the certainty in his expression to shift just slightly into something more carefully maintained. Then I walked through to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee. My hands were completely steady. I put the copy of the permit application on the kitchen table before anyone came downstairs. I did not hide it. I did not position it dramatically. I simply set it in the center of the table, face up, and made a pot of coffee and sat down to wait. Outside, the February morning was gray, and still the kind of morning in Pasadena that smelled like wet concrete and eucalyptus. A crow was working at something in the pepper tree. Derek came down first, which was what I had expected. He moved through the kitchen the way he always did, purposeful, slightly performative, like a man who believed he was being observed and wanted to appear at ease. He saw the document on the table when he was halfway to the coffee maker. He stopped. He picked it up, read it, set it back down. "Building department sent you a copy," he said. Not a question. A recalibration. "They did," I said. "Sit down, Derek." He poured his coffee first. Took his time with it. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat, wrapping both hands around his mug the way people do when they want something to hold on to. "It was exploratory," he said. "We were just seeing what the process looked like. Nobody was going to do anything without talking to you first." I put my finger on his signature at the bottom of the application. "You signed this as co-owner of my property." "It's a formality. The form requires an owner's signature and—" "You are not an owner," I said. "You have never been an owner. Your name does not appear on the deed of this property, and it never has. Signing a city permit application as co-owner when you hold no ownership interest is a violation of California Penal Code Section 115. I kept my voice the same temperature it had been since he sat down. "That is a felony." Derek's jaw worked for a moment. Then he shifted the way he always shifted when one approach failed smoothly without acknowledging the shift. He leaned back in his chair and let out a breath that was calibrated to sound like patience. "Walter," he said, "let's be realistic. You're 60 years old. You're living alone in a 4-bedroom house. That's not practical. That's not sustainable." He opened his hands on the table. "We're not trying to take anything from you. We're trying to help you find something more manageable. Something that makes sense for your age and your situation. If you sold this place, you'd have more money than you'd know what to do with." Emily had come in while he was talking. She was standing by the counter in her robe, coffee in hand, watching. She did not sit down. "And there are legal options we haven't explored," Derek continued. His voice had dropped into the register he used for what he considered serious conversations. Adverse possession, for example. Under California law, if someone occupies a property continuously For a sufficient period under certain conditions, they can establish a legal claim to it. We've been here for over a year. That's worth looking into. I took my phone out of my pocket and dialed Laura's number. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm going to put you on speaker," I said. "I have a question about adverse possession in California." A half-second pause. Then, "Go ahead." I set the phone on the table between us. "Someone is suggesting that living in a property for over a year might establish an adverse possession claim. Is that accurate?" Laura's voice came through the speaker with the flat clarity of someone who found the question mildly tedious. "No. Adverse possession in California requires 5 separate elements to be satisfied simultaneously over a continuous period of no less than 5 years. The claimant must have actual open, notorious, hostile, and exclusive possession of the property. Hostile means without the owner's permission, which is disqualifying in this situation since occupation was invited. Exclusive means the owner is not also using the property, which is also disqualifying. And 5 years is the minimum statutory period. 1 year satisfies none of these requirements." A pause. "Is there anything else?" "No," I said. "Thank you, Laura." "Of course." I ended the call and picked up my phone. Derek sat across from me with his coffee going cold in his hands, his face arranged into an expression of careful neutrality that was costing him some effort to maintain. He stood up after a moment, said nothing, and left the kitchen. I looked at Emily. She was still by the counter, her own coffee untouched, her eyes on the permit application in the center of the table. She was looking at it, the way you look at something that has just become real in a way it wasn't before. At her husband's signature printed clearly at the bottom, at the word co-owner in the ownership field. Her hand wrapped around her mug was trembling slightly at the knuckle. She set the mug down on the counter with a careful, deliberate movement. Then she walked out of the kitchen without a word, and I heard her footsteps on the stairs and then the quiet click of the bedroom door. Not a slam. A click. That click told me more than anything Derek had said. Susan came that afternoon with 2 cardboard boxes and a look on her face that meant she had been thinking carefully about timing. I held the back door open for her. She set the boxes on the workbench without ceremony and pulled the flaps back on the first one. Inside, wrapped individually in dish towels, the way Margaret used to wrap the good china before a move, were the photographs. Everyone I had carried to Susan's house over the past several months, and several more she had quietly retrieved from other places, the framed portrait from the upstairs hallway that had disappeared in October, the small oval photograph from the entry table that I had assumed was simply lost. "Helen put that one in the recycling bin," Susan said when she saw me looking at it. Third week of September. I saw her do it from across the street. I went over after dark and took it out. I held the oval photograph in both hands. It was Margaret at 31, standing in the backyard of this house the summer after we moved in, her hand raised against the sun, laughing at something I had said that I could no longer remember. The lemon tree behind her was barely shoulder height. Now it reached the second-floor window. I set it carefully on the workbench beside the others. Frank arrived 20 minutes later. He came through the side gate without knocking the way he had been doing for 30 years, and stopped when he saw the photographs lined up along the workbench. He looked at them for a long moment without speaking. Then he set his coffee thermos on the stool beside the door and pulled up the other stool and sat down. "Helen's sister is returning the table," Susan said. "Laura's letter arrived yesterday. I had not known that." Laura had sent a demand letter to Helen's sister in Monrovia the previous week, citing California Civil Code, Section 3336, wrongful conversion of personal property, and requesting the immediate return of the walnut side table. Apparently the letter had been persuasive. The sister had called Helen, Helen had called Emily, and Emily had left a note on my kitchen table that morning that said only, "The table is coming back Thursday," not an apology. A logistical update. I told Frank and Susan about the note. Frank looked at his thermos. "Progress," he said. The three of us sat in the workshop for a while without forcing conversation. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the yard, the way it always did in February, low and pale, catching the dust on the workshop windows, making the whole space feel like something preserved in amber. The lemon tree threw a long shadow across the back fence. I had been thinking about the party for 2 weeks. About the timing of it, the shape of it, the particular opportunity it represented. Richard had handed me something. Without knowing he had done it, a room full of witnesses, a moment of maximum confidence on his part, a stage already set. All I had to do was walk onto it. I told Frank and Susan what I intended to do. Frank listened with his elbows on his knees and his hands folded the way he listened to structural plans on a job site, looking for the load-bearing elements, the places where the weight would fall. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You want me at the door?" he said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "I don't want anyone leaving before I finish." He nodded. "Done." Susan had been looking at the photographs while I talked. Now she turned to face me fully. "I'll take care of the mantle," she said. "While you're talking, I'll put them back. Everyone. In the right order." Her voice was steady and uncertain, the voice of a woman who had decided something and was not revisiting it. "Margaret should be in that room when it happens." Something tightened in my throat that I chose not to examine too carefully. I nodded. "The notice is ready," I said. "Laura has the copies. I have the originals." I looked at both of them. Saturday night, I walk in, I hand Richard his copy. I read the terms, and I ask him to get out of my chair. Frank picked up his thermos and turned it over in his hands. "And Emily?" I had been thinking about that longer than anything else. "Emily is 34 years old," I said. "She makes her own choices. She made them getting into this. She'll make them getting out." I paused. "I'm not going to beg her to stay, and I'm not going to make it easy for her to pretend she had nothing to do with it." Frank nodded slowly. Susan looked at her hands. "She's still your daughter," Susan said, carefully. Not as a challenge. "She is," I said. "She always will be." But she knew about the apartment in Glendale. She knew about the plan. She stood in this house for 8 months and watched every one of those photographs come down and never once said stop. I picked up the oval photograph of Margaret and looked at it. Loving her doesn't mean pretending that didn't happen. Nobody argued with that. Laura called at 4:15. Her voice had the brisk efficiency it carried when she was confirming logistics rather than discussing options. "And everything is in order," she said. "The notice is properly drafted and executable under California Civil Code Section 1946. Service on Saturday constitutes valid notice. The 30-day period begins at the moment of delivery." A pause. "Walter, once you hand that document to Richard Lawson, the clock starts. Whatever happens in that room, the legal process is in motion, and it does not stop." "I understand," I said. "Good." Another pause, shorter. "For what it's worth, and I say this as your attorney, not as an observer, the documentation in this file is thorough. You've done the work." She hung up before I could respond, which was very Laura. Frank stayed until the light outside had gone fully dim. He helped me carry the photographs inside and set them along the windowsill in my room, away from the common areas, away from Helen's reach. We would put them back on the mantel Saturday night after. Susan had already organized them in the order she intended to place them. She had written small pencil numbers on the back of each frame. At the door, Frank paused with his hand on the frame. "You nervous?" he asked. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded, once the same nod he had given me in his kitchen, after the Glendale email, the nod that meant he believed me. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," I said. After he left, I stood in the workshop alone for a few minutes. The photographs were gone from the workbench. The tools were on the pegboard. The small wooden chair sat in the corner where it had always been. I turned off the workshop light and went inside to make dinner. The rental company arrived at 8 in the morning with a flatbed truck. I watched from the upstairs hallway window as 2 men in gray uniforms unloaded folding tables, padded chairs, a portable bar cart, and 12 large floral arrangements wrapped in cellophane. They carried everything through my front door without looking up the way people do when they have been hired to move objects from one place to another and have no particular interest in where they are. By 9:30, the living room had been rearranged around Richard's vision of what a 40th anniversary celebration should look like, and my house no longer resembled itself in any room I could see from the top of the stairs. I went to the workshop. I had work to do, a set of cabinet hinges I had been meaning to service for 3 weeks. A hand plane that needed its blade reset and sharpened. Small work. The kind of work that kept the hands busy and left the mind its own space. I sat up at the main bench and worked through the morning while the sounds of the party preparation moved through the walls of the house around me. At some point the noises stopped. The rental crew had finished and left. The house went quiet in the way it goes quiet before a significant event, not empty but held like a breath. I heard the workshop door open behind me. I did not turn around. I knew the sound of that particular hinge, the slight catch it made on the upstroke that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. I knew by the weight of the footsteps on the wooden floor lighter than Frank's slower than they used to be who it was. Emily stood a few feet inside the door. I kept working. The handplane blade needed another pass on the sharpening stone, and I gave it one, drawing the steel slowly across the surface, the way my father had taught me, heel to toe, keeping the angle consistent. She did not speak right away. I heard her move not toward me, but toward the far side of the room where the tools hung on the pegboard, and the light from the single overhead bulb caught the grain of the workbench. She stopped somewhere near the corner. I heard the sound of someone sitting down in the small wooden chair. That was the sound that made me stop. I set the plane down on the bench and straightened up. I did not turn around yet. I looked at the wall in front of me, the pegboard, the tools in their places, the outlines I had traced in marker decades ago, so I would always know what belonged where. "I miss her too, Dad," Emily said. Her voice was quiet and without performance. No preamble, no setup, no transition from something else. Just those 5 words offered into the air of the room where Margaret used to spend Saturday mornings. I let them settle for a moment. Then I turned around. Emily was sitting in Margaret's chair, not perched on the edge of it the way you sit in something that belongs to someone else settled into it. Her feet flat on the floor, her hands in her lap. She was looking at the photograph of Margaret on the small shelf above the window, the one I had put there after Susan returned it. Margaret at 53, standing in the backyard in her gardening gloves, her hair going gray at the temples, squinting into the sun with the expression of a woman who found the world genuinely interesting. I looked at my daughter looking at her mother. "Did you know about the apartment in Glendale?" I asked. I asked it the way I would ask whether a joint was flush or a measurement was accurate, not as an accusation, not as an opening to a fight, but as a question I needed an honest answer to before I could proceed. Emily's jaw moved. Her hands tightened in her lap, her fingers pressing against each other until the knuckles went pale. She opened her mouth once and closed it again. Her eyes stayed on the photograph. The answer was in all of that. I did not need her to speak it. That's all I needed to know, I said. I turned back to the workbench. I picked up the hand plane and set it in its proper place on the shelf below the pegboard heel, down blade, guarded the way you store a tool you intend to use again. Emily did not leave. I did not ask her to. We stayed like that for a long time, me at the bench, moving through the small tasks I had set for myself, and Emily in the chair, not talking, not filling the space with explanations or apologies or any of the things that would have made it easier for both of us in the short term and resolved nothing. Outside, the February afternoon, light moved across the yard. The lemon tree threw its shadow against the workshop wall, and the shadow moved as the sun moved and the afternoon went on. I thought about Margaret sitting in that same chair on a Saturday morning in March, watching me work, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her feet tucked up under her, not talking either. She had understood something that I was only now fully learning, that some kinds of company do not require conversation to be real. The light had gone copper and low by the time I heard Richard's voice from inside the house, carrying through the wall with the certainty of a man who expected to be heard. Emily. A pause. Come help us with the table. I kept my hands on the workbench. I did not look at her. I heard Emily stand up from the chair. I heard her take one step toward the door, then stop. The silence that followed was the kind that has a question in it. She was waiting for me to say something, to ask her to stay, to give her a reason that was easier than the one she already had. I did not give her one. After a moment, I heard her walk to the door. The hinge caught on the upstroke the way it always did. Then the door settled closed behind her, and I was alone in the workshop with the tools and the low light and the empty chair. I stood there for a minute, maybe two. Then I took my jacket off the hook by the door, went inside, and called Frank. "Tomorrow," I said when he picked up. "I'll be there," he said. I drove slowly down Marengo Avenue with my headlights off. It was an old habit from construction. When you arrive at a site before sunrise, you cut the lights so you do not wake the neighborhood. I had done it for 30 years without thinking. Tonight I did it deliberately because I wanted to see the house before the house saw me. The cars started 2 blocks out. They lined both sides of the street, bumper to bumper, all the way to my property line and beyond. Sedans, SUVs, a catering van, with its hazards still blinking near the hydrant. Every window of my house was lit. The sound of music reached me through the closed windows of my truck, something orchestral and celebratory that Richard had probably selected himself. I pulled to the curb at the far end of the block and cut the engine. For a moment I just sat there. The house looked the way it had always looked from this distance on winter evenings, warm and solid, the porch light catching the texture of the stonework. I had laid myself the oak tree Margaret had planted from a sapling, throwing its bare branches across the upper windows. From here at this distance, it looked like what it was. My house. I took my phone out and called Frank. He picked up on the first ring. "I'm parked on Mentor," he said. "Susan is with me. Give me 5 minutes," I said. I reached across to the passenger seat and picked up the manila envelope. It was thicker than it had been in November. Laura's notice, the permit application copies, Ray's documentation, the photographs Susan had taken from the street, the notes from every conversation I had recorded since January. 30 years of building something, and 8 months of watching someone try to take it. All of it reduced to a stack of papers in a 9x12 envelope. I got out of the truck. The night air was cold and clean, the particular cold of a Pasadena evening in late February, when the Santa Ana winds have died, and the air comes down off the mountains without anything to slow it. My breath came out in a thin cloud. I buttoned my jacket, the old canvas work jacket I had worn on job sites for 15 years, the one with the Bennett construction patch on the left breast that Margaret had sewn on herself, and started walking. Frank and Susan were waiting at the corner of Marengo and Mentor. Frank had his hands in his coat pockets. Susan was carrying a flat canvas bag, and I knew without asking that Margaret's photographs were inside it, organized in Susan's penciled order, ready to go back where they belonged. We stood at the corner for a moment. The music from the house was clearer here. Through the front window, I could see movement, the shapes of people passing, the flicker of candlelight, the warm density of a room full of gathered people. "You ready?" Frank asked. "Yes," I said. The three of us walked to the front door. I did not knock. It was my house. I opened the door and went in. The living room hit me all at once. The noise, the warmth, the smell of catered food and cut flowers, and whatever cologne Richard favored on formal occasions. 40 people filled the space, maybe more. The rental chairs were arranged in a loose configuration around the tables, which were covered in white linen and set with glassware I did not own. The floral arrangements from yesterday's delivery stood in the corners. Someone had put candles on the mantel on either side of where Margaret's photographs were not. Richard was at the head of my table. He was in a dark suit with a white pocket square. His silver hair combed back, one hand resting on the arm of my chair with the proprietary ease of a man who had stopped noticing the distinction between what belonged to him and what he had simply taken. Helen stood beside him in a floor-length dress, holding a champagne flute, speaking to a couple I had never seen. Derek was across the room near the portable bar, laughing at something, his jacket off, completely at home. Emily stood near the hallway with a glass of wine in both hands, and when our eyes met across the room, her face went through several things very quickly before it settled into an expression I could not read. I walked to the center of the room. The first person to notice me was a woman near the window. She looked up, registered something unfamiliar in my presence, and stopped speaking. The man beside her followed her eyes. That small silence spread outward through the room, the way silence spreads in a space where people are paying attention, each person catching it, from the person next to them, until the music from the speaker in the corner was the only sound left. Helen had been in the middle of a sentence. She finished it anyway, turning toward the room with her champagne flute, raised her voice, carrying the practiced projection of a woman accustomed to being heard in large spaces. "I want to say something before we sit down," she said. She smiled at the assembled guests with the warmth of someone addressing people she had known for decades. 40 years is a long time. It is a long time to build something worth keeping. She looked at Richard, who looked back at her from the head of my table with an expression of arranged dignity. "And it means everything to us that we can celebrate it here in this home, surrounded by the people we love." She raised her glass higher. "This house has finally become what it was always meant to be, a home for our family." The guests raised their glasses. In the moment before anyone drank, the front door opened fully behind me. Frank stepped in on my left. Susan stepped in on my right. I was already standing in the center of the room with the manila envelope in my hand. The woman near the window said quietly, "Who is that?" Someone else said, "Is that?" Derek saw me from across the room. His glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His face went through the same rapid sequence I had seen on job sites when a structural calculation turned out to be wrong, the moment of recognition, the recalibration, the attempt to recover before anyone else noticed. He set his glass down and started toward me. "What do you think you're doing?" he said. I looked past him to Richard, still seated at the head of my table in my chair with his hand on the arm of it. Richard had not moved. He was watching me with the careful stillness of a man who had not yet decided what was happening. I set the manila envelope on the white linen tablecloth directly in front of him, between the candlesticks and the centerpiece. "I'm taking back my house," I said. The room stayed quiet. 40 people, and nobody moved. The music from the corner speaker continued for 3 or 4 seconds before someone reached over and turned it off. And then the only sounds were the candles and the particular held quality of a room full of people who understood that something significant was happening and had not yet decided what their role in it was. Derek stepped between me and the table. His jaw was set, and his voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted to sound like the most reasonable person in a conversation. "Walter, this is not the time or the place for—" "Open the envelope," I said. He stopped. I was not looking at him. I was looking at Richard, who was still seated at the head of my table with his hand on the arm of my chair. His expression careful and neutral in the way of a man who had navigated difficult situations before and believed he could navigate this one. "Richard," I said. "Open the envelope." Richard looked at me for a long moment. Then he reached forward and opened the manila envelope and removed the documents. He looked at the top page, the notice to quit Laura's letterhead, the formal language of California Civil Code, Section 1946, laid out in clear and unambiguous terms. His jaw tightened. He set the papers down without reading further. "I'll give you one opportunity," I said, addressing the room now, not just Richard, to hear this directly from me before it comes through formal channels. The notice in front of Richard Lawson is a legally valid notice to quit, served under California law. It requires all occupants of this property who are not the titled owner to vacate the premises within 30 days of tonight. I paused. That means Richard and Helen Lawson, Derek Lawson, and Emily Bennett Lawson. 30 days from tonight. The woman near the window pressed her hand to her mouth. The man beside her looked at the floor. Richard stood up. He was a large man, and he used his size deliberately the way men do who have learned that physical presence can substitute for an argument. His face had gone red from the jaw upward, and when he spoke, his voice filled the room. "You are making a spectacle of yourself," he said. "You are embarrassing this family in front of our guests, and I will not—" "You sat in my chair," I said. My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The room was very quiet, and I had been building toward this for 8 months, and I knew exactly what I wanted to say. "You sat in my chair," I said again. "You slept in my room. You brought people into this house without my permission and told them it was yours. You tried to file a permit to demolish my workshop and signed the application as co-owner of a property that does not have your name on a single document. You directed the removal of my wife's belongings, her photographs, her furniture, her table without asking me and without my consent. I let each item settle before moving to the next. You did not think any of that was disrespectful to me. You did not think it required my permission, because you believed I would stay silent. Because every time I stayed silent before, you took it as an invitation to go further." Richard's mouth opened. Helen beside him put her hand on his arm. "You need to sit down," Richard said. "You need to get out of my chair," I said. Helen turned to Emily. "Say something," she said. Her voice had the urgency of a woman accustomed to being able to redirect situations through the right intermediary. "Emily, say something to your father." Emily was standing near the hallway. She had not moved since I walked in. Her wine glass was still in both hands, but she had stopped holding it like a drink and started holding it like something to grip. Her eyes moved between me and Richard, and then settled on me, and I could see her trying to find the version of this moment in which she did not have to choose. Derek crossed the room to her. He put his hand on her arm, not gently. "If you're not walking out that door with me right now," he said, his voice low and tight, "then we have a serious problem." Emily looked at him. Then she looked at me. She was waiting. I knew what she was waiting for. She was waiting for me to make it easier to extend something, to soften the edge of the moment enough that she could step back from the choice without feeling its full weight. I looked at my daughter across the room I had built in the house I had built on an evening I had planned for weeks, so that exactly this moment could happen with 40 witnesses and a legally valid document, and no ambiguity about where things stood. "You said it yourself," I told her. "I wasn't invited. Your father-in-law was already here." Emily's face went still. The wine glass trembled once in her hands. Behind me, I heard Susan begin to move. She went to the mantel quietly, and without hurry, the canvas bag open at her side, and she began to place Margaret's photographs back where they belonged, one by one. In order: the graduation, the backyard, the oval photograph that Helen had put in the recycling bin in September and that Susan had retrieved in the dark. Each frame settled into its place on the mantel with a soft, solid sound. Nobody stopped her. "You're 34 years old," I told Emily. "I'm not making this choice for you." Derek tightened his grip on her arm and turned toward the door. After a moment that lasted longer than it should have, long enough that I thought she might not go, Emily went with him. The front door opened and closed. I walked to the head of the table. Richard was still standing. We were the same height, which I had never particularly noticed before. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and there was nothing theatrical in it, just two men and a chair, and 30 years of accumulated difference between what had been taken and what was about to be returned. "Get out of my chair," I said. Richard Lawson sat down in that chair every morning for 4 months. He sat in it at dinner, at parties, at the anniversary celebration he had organized in my house without asking me. He sat in it the way a man sits in something he has decided belongs to him. He stood up. I pulled the chair back and sat down. The room was very still. Frank was by the door. Susan was at the mantel, the last photograph in her hands. Margaret at 31, laughing in the backyard, the lemon tree barely shoulder height behind her. Susan set it in the center of the mantel and stepped back. "The party is over," I said. People began to gather their things. There was no argument. There was the sound of chairs moving and coats being retrieved, and the particular subdued murmur of people who want to leave a place with some dignity intact. Richard said something to Helen in a low voice. Helen did not look at me. They moved toward the door with the Lawson guests folding around them, and then they were gone. And then the room was empty except for the rental furniture, and the candles burning down, and Frank standing by the door and Susan at the mantel. I sat in my chair at the head of my table. My hands were flat on the white linen. In front of me, the centerpiece Richard had ordered, white roses and eucalyptus, formal and expensive, sat between the two candlesticks. The champagne was still in its bucket. The catered food was still on the sideboard, largely untouched. Margaret's photographs were back on the mantel. Frank came and stood beside me. He put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. I looked at my wife's face in the oval photograph above the fireplace I had built with my own hands, and I breathed out slowly, completely, the way you breathe when something that has been pressing on your chest for a very long time has finally at last been lifted. They were gone within 3 weeks. Richard and Helen left first, the Monday after the party. I heard them in the morning, the particular sounds of people packing who do not want to be heard, packing, the careful footsteps, and the muffled dragging of luggage along the upstairs hallway. I was in the kitchen making coffee. I did not go upstairs. At 9:15, I heard the front door open and close twice, And when I looked out the kitchen window, I saw Richard loading the last of the bags into their SUV. He did not look toward the house. Helen did not come to say goodbye. The SUV backed out of my driveway and turned south on Marengo, and that was the end of Richard and Helen Lawson. Derek and Emily took until the following Friday. I do not know where they went. Frank told me later they had found a furnished apartment in Alhambra on short notice, which explained the cost and the size. Derek's boxes went out in a rented van. Emily's things went in the back of their car, and Emily herself carried the last box out the front door on a gray Friday morning without looking back at the house. I watched from the upstairs window. I do not know why I watched from upstairs instead of standing at the door. Perhaps because I did not want her to feel observed. Perhaps because I did not trust what my face would do. The car pulled away. The street was empty. I stood at the upstairs window for a while. Then I went downstairs and made myself lunch and ate it at my table in my chair in the quiet that had settled over the house like something that had always been there and had simply been crowded out for a while. The following weeks had a rhythm to them that I had forgotten was possible. Frank came on a Tuesday with his truck and helped me carry Richard's remaining furniture to the curb, 3 pieces he had left, without asking, apparently assuming someone would deal with them. We put them out before 8 in the morning, and by noon they were gone, taken by neighbors I had never met who had seen them from the street. Frank stayed for coffee afterward, and we sat in the kitchen and talked about nothing consequential for an hour, which was exactly what the morning called for. Susan brought the last of Margaret's things back that same week. The walnut table came on a Thursday, delivered by Helen's sister in a station wagon, accompanied by a note that said only, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," which was not much of an apology, but was more than I had expected from that direction. I carried the table back to the reading room myself and set it in the indentation in the carpet where it had stood for 22 years. Then I put Margaret's reading lamp back on it and her copy of the bird identification guide she had kept there since the mid-90s, and I sat in the chair beside it for a few minutes without reading anything. It felt right. It felt like something returning to its correct position after a long displacement, the way a joint feels when it finally seats properly after being out of alignment. Laura called in the 3rd week to tell me that Ray Dominguez had forwarded the permit application file to the city attorney's office and that Derek had retained a lawyer. She said this without editorial comment, in the same tone she used for all factual information, and I received it the same way. Whatever happened in that process would happen without me. It was not my business to pursue it. I had what I needed. I repainted the master bedroom on a Saturday in April, a warm gray that Margaret had once torn out of a paint catalog and taped to the wall to see how the color looked in the morning light. She had never gotten around to using it. I stood in the paint aisle at the hardware store on Lake Avenue for 10 minutes before I found the chip that matched. I mixed 2 gallons and spent the day doing it myself, which took longer than it would have taken 30 years ago, but felt correct in a way that hiring someone would not have. I found the sign on the last Saturday of April, which was not where I had expected to find it. I had been clearing the back of the garage, the section Derek had claimed for his bicycles and equipment, which he had taken with him, but left the wall hooks and floor marks behind. I was pulling the hooks out of the wall studs when I found the sign behind a sheet of plywood that had been used to partition the space. Margaret's sign. The one she had painted herself in the 2nd year of our marriage, white letters on a dark green background, the paint slightly uneven in the way of something made by hand rather than produced. She had put it on the front porch the week we moved in, and it had stayed there for 25 years until a windstorm took it down, and it ended up in the garage. And I had always meant to remount it, and never had. Bennett home. I carried it outside into the April morning, and leaned it against the fence and looked at it. The paint had faded somewhat, and there was a crack in the lower left corner that had not been there before the windstorm, but the letters were still clear and the green was still the green Margaret had chosen from the color cards at the hardware store, with the seriousness of a person making a decision that mattered. I got a brush and touched up the crack. I let it dry in the sun for 2 hours. Then I found the right hardware in my workshop, 2 heavy-duty exterior screws, and the appropriate anchors for the porch pillar, and I remounted the sign in the position it had occupied for 25 years. I stood back and looked at it. It looked right. It looked like it had never been anywhere else. Emily appeared on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of June, which I had not expected, but had not been entirely unprepared for either. I heard her car in the driveway and went to the front door and opened it before she knocked. She looked tired. Not the tired of a bad night, but the tired of several bad months. Something worn into the set of her shoulders and the skin around her eyes that did not go away when she straightened up at the sight of me. She was carrying nothing. No box, no bag, no offering. She had just come. "Hi, Dad," she said. "Emily," I said. We stood at the door for a moment. She looked past me into the house at the entry, the hallway, the framed photograph of Margaret that I had rehung on the wall beside the staircase. She looked at it for long enough that I knew she was really looking at it, not just glancing. "The house looks like itself again," she said. "Yes," I said. "Come in." We sat at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, the one that had been in this house for 26 years, and I made coffee, and we talked carefully the way people talk when they are finding the boundaries of something new. She told me that she and Derek were separated. She said it plainly without drama in the voice of a person who had already spent a significant amount of time with the fact and had arrived at a working relationship with it. She said that the apartment in Alhambra was hers, now that Derek had moved out in May, that she was looking for work closer to Pasadena. She did not ask to move back in. I had thought she might and had prepared something to say, but she did not ask. Instead, when the coffee was almost gone, she looked at the table between us and said, "I knew about the apartment in Glendale. I want you to know that I know you know, and that I'm not going to pretend otherwise." I looked at my daughter. "I'm not going to explain it," she said. "I don't think an explanation would be the right thing right now. I just wanted to say that I know." I nodded. "Can I come for dinner sometime?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "You can always come for dinner." She left an hour later. I stood on the porch and watched her car go down Marengo, and I felt the complicated thing that is loving someone who has hurt you, and understanding that both of those facts are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other. Frank and Susan came that evening, which they had started doing on Tuesdays, without any particular arrangement, the way old friendships establish their own routines. Susan brought food. Frank brought his thermos. I had put the porch chairs out for the first time since autumn, and after we ate, we sat outside in the June evening with the last of the light going gold behind the San Gabriel Mountains. The lemon tree Margaret had planted the year we moved in was in full leaf. The oak tree spread across the upper windows the way it had always done in summer. The sign on the porch pillar caught the last of the evening light. Frank looked at the house for a while. Then he looked at me. "You lonely," he said. I thought about it honestly the way I had learned in 60 years to think about things that deserved an honest answer. I looked at the sign Margaret had painted in the second year of our marriage. I looked at the lemon tree and the oak tree and the porch where we had sat on summer evenings for 30 years. I looked through the front window at the hallway where her photograph hung on the wall, and I thought about the reading room with the walnut table returned to its proper place, and the workshop with the tools on their pegboard, and the small wooden chair in the corner, and the dining room with the oak table at its center, and the chair at its head where I had sat for dinner that evening alone and without apology. I thought about Emily coming to dinner. I thought about what it meant to build something, not just to put the materials together, but to understand which things were load-bearing and which things were ornamental, and to know the difference well enough that when the ornamental things were stripped away, what remained was still standing. Quiet and lonely aren't the same thing, I said. Frank nodded once, slowly. Susan reached over and put her hand over mine on the arm of the chair and left it there, and nobody said anything else for a while. And the evening came in around us, the way evenings do when you are exactly where you are supposed to be, gradually and without announcement, and with the particular quality of light that makes familiar things look like themselves again. I spent 60 years believing that staying quiet was the same as keeping the peace. It is not. If I could go back, I would have spoken sooner. Not with anger, anger builds nothing, but with clarity. A man who builds a home with his own hands, who raises a child through the hardest years, who keeps his word every single day, that man deserves to be seen. Not tolerated. Seen. I believe God gives each of us a life worth protecting. When I finally stood up, I was not just taking back a house. I was taking back myself. My opinion for what it is worth love without boundaries is not love. It is an open door that the wrong people will always walk through. These are the quiet, ordinary battles no one talks about. The ones fought not in courtrooms, but in kitchens, basements, and dining rooms built by hand. If you have ever felt invisible in your own life, you already know that standing up for yourself is never about bitterness. It is about dignity. And dignity, like a well-built house, is always worth protecting. It begins the moment we stop asking for permission to exist. If Walter's story moved something in, you leave a comment, tell me where you are watching from. Share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Thank you so much for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted for reflection and personal growth. If this kind of content is not for you, no judgment, simply find what serves you better. But if it is, we will see you in the next one.